genocide, exploitation, and environmental plunder. Actually, we are marking more than 150 years of resistance. Indigenous people of this land have been here for thousands of years, and they never conceded the land to the invaders from Europe. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit and Haudenosaunee people. A gala is a special occasion, a showcase of stories and ongoing struggles. It is more than a forum, and it will include dialogue and a written resolution about the way forward. Tonight, you will hear from a number of speakers and performers. Our aim is to bring to life important chapters of Canada's real history and prehistory. This gala is in contrast to the mindless cheerleading for the Canadian state by the corporate media and bourgeois politicians. They have been trying to drown us in patriotism, especially over the past month. We aim to shine a bright light on the often hidden features of injustice and oppression that constitutes the roots of the state. We aim to expose the reality of its policies and practice today. In keeping with the words of Karl Marx, written over 150 years ago, we seek not just to interpret the world, but to change it. So we're going to open up this evening, first of all, before we ask our first speaker up, with a song from our dear friend, singer and songwriter, Mama D.
And I'm a bunch of other things too.
You certainly are, Sister.
I'm working with Kairos now, and it's a real pleasure. I'm one of the coordinators of the blanket exercise. Now, this song I wrote 35 years ago, took people a while to catch up with it. Took me 25 years to get it recorded and 10 years to get it into a CD. Because I have no corporate sponsors. That's great. A bloody beach of burning trees, the boats have landed. But the line from the ship to the shore in our command now. To the peacemakers, healers, the drummers, the lovers, the dreamers before us. Your words are strong, they carried us on. What can we make of this? You have smiled as you've recounted your great victories. You have sung your many anthems without their harmonies. You have cried to your mother's mother, and still you'd let it be. You would turn on your own cousins to write your history. And on the evidence you've been found guilty. And on the evidence we have paid some price. And on the evidence you're implicated. And on the evidence it is time for reparation. There's been a pushing of many souls into oblivion. We have been offered in return a nearless Babylon, a textbook heaven we can't touch, for lives cut down with pain. You have bled poisons into hearts, you'd piss on anything. luck for all, agree for all your plotted trail. Till now your breath like a wicked storm blows itself across the scale. And on the evidence you're implicated, and on the evidence we have paid some price, and on the evidence you've been found guilty.
Okay, folks, thank you again, Mama D. So our format tonight is we're going to have, a few speakers up. Most of our speakers will be speaking on different topics, of course, up to 5 minutes. But our keynote speaker will get up to 20 minutes. And our keynote speaker, our first presenter, is Sister Carrie Lester. And she's Mohawk land defender and water protector, Idle No More, Toronto, and Giwaabimin Street Patrol. First contact, colonial wars of expansion and genocide. 7 years war, suppression of Riel rebellions, residential schools, the white paper, Oka Crisis, missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, and reconciliation. So please welcome Sister Carrie Lester.
Thanks, Mama D, for that song, really appropriate. The evidence is there, and they are guilty. Everybody hear me okay?
That mic is not working.
This one's not working?
No, don't have any mics.
No,
Sorry,
so I'm
sister.
just speaking.
So you're just speaking, yes.
Forget
From
that.
the heart, from the
Okay, all right.
diaphragm.
So I spent this last week trying to prepare for this, busy with so many other things, and I finally spent these last couple of days trying to buckle down and get this information written down. My head was all over the place, but I had to keep going over the list that Barry had set forth for me. I didn't touch on all those topics that he brought forward. When he mentioned the white paper right now, I went, oh my God, yeah, I forgot the white paper. Anyway, I'll go through what I've written to try and keep it into the 20 minutes. I've written things down, so some of it's going to come from my heart, some of it's going to come from the paperwork just to keep me on track. So here we go. I'll put my glasses on. So I've been asked to speak about the colonization of Turtle Island, also known as the Americas, in particular that area which has since 1867 become known as the Corporation of Canada, previously the Dominion of Canada, a colony of Britain, the United Kingdom, which began in earnest after the exploits of one Christopher Columbus in 1492. Many of us know bits and pieces of all this history through our grade school, high school, possibly post-secondary education, but we learned it through really rather dry textbook accounts of the names, dates, and places. I've only got these 20 minutes to relate this information on a bit of a timeline, and I have to go onto the internet to gather all that data once again. So in order to keep it from in those 20 minutes, yes, I'm going to read my thoughts. Prior to the arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean and what he wrongly assumed was India on his way to China, there have been other well-known and some lesser well-known arrivals of others to these shores. According to online encyclopedias, through archaeological evidence, there have been travel here and attempted settlements on the east coast of so-called Canada, in what we now know as Newfoundland and Labrador, from the late 900s through to the 1470s, from the Norse, the Irish, the English, and even the Portuguese in 1473. There have also been some archaeologists that travel, there have also thoughts from some archaeologists that travel from Polynesian countries had taken place around the southern tip of so-called South America. But all this postdates the habitation of the indigenous people who have been here for millennia. For example, Iroquoian settlements and burials go back many thousands of years right here in this very place of Tacalondo, Toronto, for up to 10,000 years. Archaeological remains of other indigenous sites have now finally been dated to between 40 and 50,000 years across North America. Highly developed languages, like many indigenous languages, take tens of thousands of years to develop. The beginning of what the history books call the Age of Exploration, but which I call the Age of Invasion, begins with the two decrees from the Vatican, also known as the Papal Bulls. 1452 and 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued two papal bulls, pretty much declaring a religious war against any non-believers they came across during their invasions into other people's territories, in particular throughout the African continent, relegating many into perpetual slavery, while others were outright slaughtered. These were the papal bills called the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex, respectively, claiming lands and slaves for the Portuguese, using their Bibles, flags, and swords. 1493, that was after Columbus's first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull called the Inter Cetera for Christopher Columbus to carry with him on his second voyage, here and onwards, for which he declared war upon the inhabitants of what they called the New World, the lands that we know as the Americas, and what they thought was the passage through India to China. Columbus took 4 separate voyages to try and establish Christian settlements for the Spanish crown of Castile. While the African continent was claimed for Portugal, the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, this side, was claimed for Spain, except for those lands that we know as Brazil, which remained in Portuguese domination, through an arbitrary line through the map. Columbus's second voyage also consisted of 17 warships, armored attack horses and dogs, with which he used to stomp and tear apart the bodies of indigenous peoples. Any idea that this man had simple and peaceful trade ideas with India and China should be recognized by all of us as being fully deceitful. Many of these invaders had specialities with which they wrought their destruction. Some of what was noted with Columbus's voyages were running swords across the necks of the indigenous peoples to test the sharpness of the swords, to see how many swipes it would take to take their heads off. Also ripping open the bodies of pregnant women and stomping on the fetuses, grabbing the legs of children and smashing them against walls. So now here we have a quick rundown of the invasion of the Americas, particularly here in so-called Canada. In the 1400s, I don't know how to pronounce his name, it's Spanish, João Fernandez Lavrador. In 1473, he maps and claims Labrador. 1497 to 1498, John Cabot, Giovanni Cabato, made 2 voyages across the Atlantic, landing in either Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island or Labrador or even Maine. It's said that he did not advance inland much more than the distance of a crossbow firing, only enough to plant flags and banners for England and the Vatican. Amerigo Vespucci, 1498 to 1502, he was an Italian sailing for Portugal. He maps of parts of what will become known as South America, and the names of North and South America bear his name. In the 1500s, Jacques Cartier, and I remember Cartier as being one of the first French to come across. When I think of Cartier's name, I think of cartographers and map makers, and that reminds me that in the 1500s he was that first one to begin that mapping up here. So he reaches Quebec as he travels along what becomes the St. Lawrence River, certain that he will find his way to China, and he makes 3 more voyages over the next decade. Along the way, he meets up with the Mi'kmaq, as 50 canoes come out to greet him. But when more canoes arrive, he gets a little nervous and shoots his cannons to scare the rest off. But he does make some trade with them. And then the Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. He names the land Canada, because of the Iroquois word for village, Canada. And he plants that cross, claiming the land for the King of France, but lies to the Royani, the chief, Donnacona, telling him that cross really is simply a marker for him for his return visits. He and his crew slaughtered thousands of great auk birds, now extinct. He captured specimens of the Iroquois, 2 of the 3 sons of the Royani, Chief Donnacona, to bring back to France. And he returns the following year with those 2 young men, who have learned enough French now to tell him about a place called Saguenay, where riches abound. His ship gets icebound before leaving from his second voyage to head back home, and scurvy is rampant. But he learns about the nourishing cedar and pine to rid themselves of the scurvy, to bring in that vitamin C. Royani Donnacona, the chief, and his 2 sons, plus 3 other men and 4 children were then kidnapped, again, and taken to France, where all but 1 girl died over a 5-year period. On his final voyage, that's when Cartier finds that iron pyrite and the quartz, thinking it's gold and diamonds. And he fills his ships with them, but this failure ends his voyages. During the 1500s and 1600s, many European nations traveled to the so-called New World, causing much calamity, death, and destruction, bringing their diseases and their diseased ways with them. The diseases spread like wildfire throughout the lands. Explorers or invaders such as Hernan Cortez, Ponce de Leon, he's that Fountain of Youth guy, Oñate, Hernando de Soto in the south, and then up in the north here, Martin Frobisher and Sir Francis Drake. They all arrived, claimed land, stole resources, enslaved and raped and slaughtered the peoples. The French, the English, the Spanish, Dutch, Scottish, Swedish, they all came. In the back to that one fella, Oñate. He also had some rather detrimental and special things he would do upon the people of the South through Central America. When he enslaved the men, he would then cut off one of their legs. I think it was his left leg, and that was to keep them, in control, not being able to run away. And he did this to many of the slaves, the enslaved peoples. And later on, a statue was built for him and the people of that area. I forget the year, but it's in recent time, over the past 100 and so years. That left leg on his statue was then ripped off, point for point. Yes. In the 1600s, Samuel de Champlain, he was French. Henry Hudson for the British. Hendrik Christiansen, he was Dutch. In 1608, Champlain founded the city of Quebec, named for the Mi'kmaq word Quebec, or the Narrows. He made relations with many of the indigenous inland around the St. Lawrence, such as the Innu, the Montagnais, Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, encouraging the trade in furs for European implements and guns. His relationship with the Iroquois was not favorable, as the relationship between the Huron-Wendat was still broken. Even though the Huron-Wendat are our cousins, our Iroquoian cousins, years back, about 1,000 years ago, we all came under a peace treaty, which is the purple flag with the boxes in the tree, that 3rd flag back there. That brought the 5 nations together under peace. The Huron, the peacemaker who began the peacemaking endeavors, his people, the Huron-Wendat, did not join up in that peace. So that flag represents those who did come into the peace, which is the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and the Seneca, with the pathways open to all who want to come under that tree of peace. And my impression of why they were at war with each other back then, there had been a huge geological climactic event that had taken place around that time that had put the northern hemisphere into a mini ice age, and that of course causes a domino effect of animals and people to migrate away from the cold because things are not growing properly, animals are not finding their food, and so that ripple effect brought people on top of each other, causing a lot of the wars that had taken place. So in the 60s, here we are. So it was during this time that the power of guns was shown, as Champlain shot and killed 2 of the chieftains, the Royani, with 1 shot. And he killed and a 3rd one was killed by another shot. Champlain continued his travels inland through southern Ontario and upstate New York, looking for that passage to China still, but encountering Iroquois villages all along the way, both Huron-Wendat and those of the 5 Nations Confederacy. Hudson had mapped out the river that would then bear his name, the Hudson River in upstate New York, later to be fortified by the Dutch under Hendrik Christiansen around 1613 to 18, in an area they called Fort Nassau, later to be known as Albany. It was likely at this time that the Iroquois encountered the Dutch, which led to the 1613 Two-Row Wampum Agreement, this flag here, it's a wampum that this flag represents. The Two-Row was to be a non-interference agreement between the Dutch and the Iroquois to respect each other's ways. Peace, respect, and friendship are what the white rows of beads stand for. And the purple signified the two vessels along that river of life that the peoples were traveling along. One for the canoes of the indigenous peoples and one for the ship of the newcomers. And because they're parallel lines, they don't intersect and do not interfere with each other. Of course, this didn't last long. Eventually his ship was attacked, his ship and crew were attacked by indigenous peoples in 1619. I don't know which indigenous peoples those were. It didn't say. One indeed looks the same as another. So, however, the Tura Wampum was a treaty agreement that was used with every subsequent nation that arrived on these shores, in particular with the British, who made a great show of it, forging their own symbol of iron in it, linking three chains together for peace, respect, and friendship. But the iron was soon found to rust too easily, and then a silver chain was made. This was known as the Silver Covenant chain, which just needed polishing now and again, to remind the holders of the agreement that the relationship also needed polishing now and again. Throughout the 1600s, the Beaver Wars took place between the Iroquois and the French throughout the St. Lawrence River area and Lake Ontario and beyond. And then there were the non-stop series of wars between the invaders and the indigenous peoples, as the invaders sought control of the lands, resources, and waters. And to name but a few, there were the British Powhatan Wars and massacres, the Pequot Wars, these were all along the eastern seaboard, King Philip's War of New England and St. Lawrence River, the Tuscarora War of North Carolina, the Yamasee War of South Carolina, Dummer's War with the Wabanaki in Acadia, Pontiac's War of the late 1700s. It was during Pontiac's War that the idea of driving out the invaders was becoming an established goal of the indigenous peoples. We had had enough. Divisions between tribes along the coast of New England, Virginia, North and South Carolina were all caught up in the chaos of the encroaching and invading peoples from across the Atlantic. In the 1700s, the French, British, German, and Danish explorers, invaders, continued to make their way inland from the east, wreaking havoc upon indigenous villages, continuing to uproot their way of life with guns and alcohol, discouraging the agricultural ways by encouraging all-out annihilation of the fur-bearing animals for the fur trade, all the while waging war against themselves back in Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1714 ended the 14-year war between France, Spain, Britain, and Portugal, and which continued to play chess with the traditional lands here of the indigenous people in North America. The 7 Years' War was another global war that took place from 1756 to 1763 throughout Europe, between Britain, Prussia, Portugal on one side, and Spain, France, Austria, and Russia on the other, for that domination. But that war spilled over to both India and here in North America. Here it was known as the French-Indian Wars. The European battles involved a whole lot of positioning that I won't even pretend to understand. Throughout all of this, lands continue to be taken from indigenous peoples by proclamation, including that huge swath of land across more than 1/3 of Canada known as Rupert's Land by the Hudson's Bay Company, which controlled the area as a commercial operation for 200 years, from 1670 to 1870. The French-Indian Wars and the 7 Years' Wars culminated in the 1763 Treaty of Paris and the 1763 Royal Proclamation, in which France gave up its New France holdings in America, but keeping some of the Caribbean islands for the cane sugar production. 2013 was the 250th anniversary of that Royal Proclamation, which for First Nations peoples was supposed to protect our lands from settlers purchasing lands by means of having to go through the Crown in order to make that purchase. It was also known as the Indian Magna Carta for that supposed protection. It was a precursor to the advent of the reservation system, which laid out some protection for hunting and fishing rights. A year later, in 1764, the Treaty of Niagara came into effect, which was to guarantee a whopping further 4-mile strip of land along the Niagara River's western shore to be the possession of the 24 indigenous nations who attended that ceremony. 10 years later, in 1774, the Quebec Act took place, which allowed for expansion of the province of Quebec to take possession of more lands surrounding the whole of the Great Lakes, including down the Ohio River. This was an alarming venture to the 13 colonies, which had been establishing themselves throughout the east coast of the present-day United States from 1732 to 76. They considered this one of the intolerable acts, which led to the War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War. Taxation without representation was another one of those intolerable acts. The Quebec Act and the Royal Proclamation were both used as a way to appease the Indians by granting them protected lands, and so put an end to the revolts that kept cropping up, like Pontiac's War of 1766. 1775 to 83, the Revolutionary War between the 13 colonies and Britain takes place, and it brings about much destruction of the traditional lands and the indigenous peoples of the East. During the 1779 Sullivan Campaign, or Sullivan Expedition, or Sullivan-Clinton Expedition, under George Washington, the Iroquois villages in present-day upstate New York, around what we know as the Finger Lakes, were systematically wiped out and burnt out. Our people there had food stores unlike anything the invaders had ever seen before. Stores of food that would last us 7 years. Fruit tree groves as far as the eyes could see, particularly peach trees. And the same with our other agricultural crops, like the beans, squash, and corn. All of this was burnt out. Men, women, and children slaughtered and driven out. That upcoming winter would be one of the harshest, which further killed off many of our people. Washington and every subsequent president and prime minister since then have all been known as Hanadagayas, town destroyers. This then led to those surviving, along with other British loyalists, to head north to southern Ontario, where they were allowed to settle. Remember, this is still Iroquois land all around Lake Ontario and this side of Lake Erie.
5 minutes.
But we were allowed to settle there. The Haldimand Tract of 1784 was what became the territory for the Six Nations of the Grand River to be established, which encompassed the whole of the Grand River from mouth to source, Lake Erie to the Elora area, and 6 miles on either side, almost 1 million acres. This is also what came into dispute during the 2006 Six Nations land reclamation from the town of Caledonia, in which the town had illegally sold off a parcel of land to a developer. 1795 was a Jay Treaty, which resolved outstanding issues between Britain and USA, and also allowed for the passage of Indians, First Nations people, unmolested across that border, that imaginary line. The 1800s, yikes, I still have several pages. The 1800s was the War of 1812. It ended any military need of the invaders to have support from the indigenous peoples, who were by now so demoralized from several hundred years of war, theft, and lies. 1870s to 1921 brought about the numbered treaties across Canada, through which people like Duncan Campbell Scott took part in a way to deceitfully gain access to indigenous lands deeper into the country. This was also the beginning of the Indian residential school system, with the first one being the Mohawk Institute near Brantford at the Six Nations Reserve in 1832. 1867 was, of course, the Constitution of the Dominion of Canada, giving Canada a certain amount of independence from Britain. 1876, the beginning of the Indian Act, which I believe is the only race-based legislation in the world, controlling the abilities of a whole race of people from birth to death. 1824 was the American counterpart, with the advent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. 1830-68 was a forced relocation and Indian removal from east to west. 1868-87 was the American forced assimilation policy. And 1887 to 1934 was the Dawes General Allotment Act, giving lands to individual Indians rather than nations as a whole. 1921, Duncan Campbell Scott decries that every Native child from the age of 6 to 16 is to be apprehended and brought to Indian residential schools, and the parents are to sign guardianship over to church or state. The age becoming younger, generation after generation, as it becomes more and more difficult for traumatized people to raise their own children. 1924, Duncan Campbell Scott uses Section 74 of the Indian Act to force the Six Nations Reserve to overthrow their own traditional longhouse governance system, and to be overthrown by their own members, who became known as dehorners, which allowed them to institute foreign elected band council system. My own great-great-grandfather was one of these dehorners. He and one of his brothers became band council chiefs during this time. Both had graduated from the Mushhole, the Indian residential school in Brantford. This then spread across the land, resulting in very few governance systems remaining intact after having to go underground or be incarcerated. 1950, I'll leave that one out. 1990, the Oka Crisis. 1995, Gustafson Lake out west in BC. 1995, Dudley George. So 1990 was the Oka Crisis, 78-day standoff between at Ganasataki near Montreal. The town of Oka wanted to expand the golf course into the Pine Cemetery of the Mohawk of Ganasatagi. Mulroney was the PM during this time, and it was he who sent in the military, rather than easily assisting the Mohawk in their claim and protection of their lands. Gustafson Lake was a month-long standoff between the Chapoemec, or the Shuswap, and the RCMP, the police and the military over a piece of farmland that was traditional territory of the Shuswap, and a sacred place of ceremony for Sundance, and which the ranch owner had grazing rights for his cattle. He allowed ceremonies to take place there previously, but when the shoe shop set up fences to keep the cows out of the ceremonial area, he thought they were staking off land for themselves. One thing led to another, and by the end of the month-long standoff, over 77,000 rounds of ammunition were fired off by the Canadian government agencies. It was the costliest standoff in Canadian history. 95 was Dudley George, Ipperwash Park, the shore of Lake Huron, traditional territory of the Kettle and Stony Point Chippewa. The military had expropriated lands during the Second World War to use as training grounds, with the promise of handing the lands back after the war. This was never agreed to by the Chippewa, partly because they had burial grounds there. But the lands were taken and never handed back. Tensions increased throughout this time. Michael Harris was the newly elected Premier of Ontario, and he was taped on the phone saying things such as, "I want the fucking Indians out of the park." Over Labor Day weekend, that's all it was, Labor Day weekend, several members of the Chippewa Stony Point began the occupation that resulted in the OPP moving in, shooting and killing young Dudley George when it was thought he was holding a rifle. It was later determined he had a flashlight.
Shame.
Shame.
In 2007, the Ontario government agreed to return the lands to the Chippewa, but it wasn't until 2016 that this actually took place. Why? Because it was figured that they now knew how to handle things. The Indians could now handle things. 1992 to 2002, Burnt Church. It was a fishing dispute between the Mi'kmaq and non-native fisherfolk, in which the Mi'kmaq were upholding their treaty rights of 1752 and 1760, that they were allowed to fish out of season according to the Department of Fisheries schedule. Non-native fisherfolks were angry, began destroying the lobster traps of the Mi'kmaq. This led to much anger, violence, with burnings of buildings, truck ramming and boat ramming and sinking. The Mi'kmaq member, Donald Marshall, who you may remember in '71 was wrongfully convicted of murder, was also involved in this fishing dispute. And he went to court against the Crown in 1999, winning the case for treaty fishing rights, yet again. Today we still see the oppression of the state against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, with land and water issues, child apprehension issues, youth suicides, adult mental distress, intergenerational trauma, missing and murdered women, men, boys, and girls, extraction development monies, termination papers, puppet regime, banned councils, trillions of dollars of money held in trust by the government from extraction and land reclamation, often thought to be used to pay off government debts. The Grand River Navigational Company, which expropriated monies from the Six Nations Grand River to build a dam and to build a canal, flooding 2,600 acres of land without compensation and without proper consultation. Continued surveillance and criminalization of grassroots people standing up for rights. The civil rights movement of AIM during the 60s and 70s and onwards. The constitutional talks of the 80s, which all in the 60s also, we think back to the White Paper, which they got rid of the Indian Act and Indian people altogether, which means there'd be no more Indian people to hold title to land. Also, the continued surveillance of women and fighting in courts of women who are standing up for their matrimonial status rights. When I think back to the navigational monies from the Grand River, a lot of those monies went to build the infrastructure of Toronto, like Osgoode Hall, the Montreal Turnpike. There was the Bank of Upper Canada it went to pay for, plus other roads. Also, when we think of it, I'm just about done, my last point.
It's okay, take a couple, 3 minutes, Carrie, it's okay.
This is it. When we think of a reserve was an area with a defined border. This was never meant for First Nations populations to develop and grow and flourish. They were always meant to disappear, because once Indians are gone, there's no more title to land, and the land and resources all belong to the Crown and Canada. There we go, that's it. My apologies if you all couldn't hear what I was saying, and I kind of speedily get through it all.
Did quite well.
I can leave, I'll send my notes to you, so if you want to put them in a paper that they can be there for people
For
to
sure.
read. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Now,
Okay.
Thank you.
thank you very much.
So our next presenters will have up to 5 minutes each to speak. And our next presenter is Brother Charles Nantel, an interpreter with roots in Quebec.
So I was asked to go through the history of Quebec in 5 minutes. So I made a few cards. So here we go. The settlement of New France, like we just heard, took place in 1608, Quebec City. There is a major confusion on the name Quebec. What we just heard, it may be true. What I've heard is that Quebec was never called Quebec by First Nation people. It's what the Europeans heard when they arrived on their boat, and the people there didn't know that they were bringing plague with them, so they said, "Kapak, kapak, get off the boat," right, to greet them. What you referred to in 5 minutes ago, I think, is Tadakone, which means a narrow strait.
Yes.
So apparently, kapak is a verb to second person plural imperative to mean get off the boat. 1608, so it could have been before, like we just heard in 1534, Jacques Cartier was on this continent, but it led to no settlement. It would seem that the wars of religion in Europe kept Europeans busy, and they forgot about the project of installing themselves on the continent. So in Quebec City, it's Samuel de Champlain, like we just heard, who made the settlement. It's the same Samuel de Champlain that made the settlement with the Acadians in 1604. But that's considered a rural establishment, so this is why 1608 is sort of a fetishistic date for the establishment of Europeans in North America, because it's an urban settlement that has been occupied ever since. The first conquest of New France happened in 1629. It's a group of hooligan brothers who thought that a certain dowry was not paid in some kingly marriage in Europe, and they decided to besiege Quebec City because of that. When they heard the news that the dowry was paid, I guess they left. In the winter of 1629, the people of Quebec City actually seriously thought of going to spend the winter with the Indians, because Indians were more skillful in protecting themselves against the cold, but they did not do that. So it can be said that Quebec City has been occupied as an urban center since 1608 uninterrupted. Second conquest is 1759, the Plains of Abraham, where the British were successful against the French. But a few days or weeks after, the French were victorious against the British in Sillery, close by. So we can say that the second conquest did not succeed. What succeeded is the phase 2 of the ethnic cleansing operation of Acadia. The General Monckton, who is vastly responsible for the deportation of Acadians in 1755, came within the St. Lawrence River and created rampage with the villagers on the shores, and finally arrived in Quebec. And since the French did not bother to go, the two armies in a standstill, the French had to give up, because the reinforcement came from the British instead of the French. So that was the capitulation and the invasion of the British of New France. So the Monckton and his soldiers progressed from Quebec City towards Montreal, and at the same time General Amherst was caught Montreal, and they met in the middle. And the agreement of 1763, the Treaty of Paris, is what made North America basically English. The rebellions of 1834 and 1835, it's basically an issue of devolution. People wanted to have more power to make decisions for themselves here, instead of relying on Britain.
Louder, please.
In Quebec, it resulted in the creation of the Republic of Quebec. People mostly wanted a republican system instead of what they had. They were actually ready to join the United States just to get rid of the British system. The rebellion was crushed in blood, and the merchants of Montreal actually took revenge against villages around Montreal, south and north of Montreal, including people that had not taken part in the rebellion. So it was ugly. then Lord Durham arrived to, was invited to find a solution, and
2 minutes.
he said that the people in Quebec had no history and no literature, therefore the solution was assimilation. So this resulted in the Union of 1840, and this was basically to create a minority of French Canadians who were a majority. It was to create a minority. The minority happened in 1843. With the immigration of the Irish people fleeing Ireland in 1845, because Quebec was flooded with English-speaking people, and the British were successful in creating a minority. The Confederation of 1867 is basically the conservative against the liberal. The conservative had a very system that it was to make a British Canada as opposed to two nations. The liberals wanted two nations, and the conservatives wanted a British Canada, and they won. They were in power. So it was mostly for business purposes, the main issue being the railroad to the Pacific. The Quiet Revolution of 1960-1966 is when Quebec acquires the structure of a state, and Canada imitates Quebec and starts to have all sorts of programs that Canada didn't have before, and sovereignty of Quebec becomes a serious option. The War Measure Act of 1970, it was basically to scare PQ organizers and voters to not support the PQ. 500 people plus were arrested and put in jail with no accusations. The PQ was elected in 1976 nonetheless. The referendum of 1980 was titled Sovereignty Association. It was basically renewed federalism. It was not really independence. The result was 44 and 60 against. The referendum of 1995 was sovereignty partnership. That was real independence. The result was 49.5 for and 50.5 against. Quebec Solidaire is a party that has been around for a few years. It has 2 seats. They're from Montreal.
3.
Dr. Kadir and Françoise David, who left for health reasons recently and was replaced by Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, which is the leader of Classe, of the student protest of 2012. National aspirations. I was in Quebec recently, and all I see is the acceptance of the status quo. I think the dream of Lord Durham is happening. I think assimilation is a reality. It's very difficult to find a unilingual French Canadian in Quebec. Outside of Quebec, French is definitely on the wane. In Ontario, people speaking French are basically the African immigrants. This is what I noticed. Well, okay. Apparently, we're not a happy family in Canada. Well, in Quebec, you can say that it is a happy family because there's no, nobody expresses any unhappiness about anything. So it just seems that assimilation is happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, brother. Okay, so we're speaking as loud as we can. For those people at the back that may be having a little trouble hearing, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7, 8 chairs up here, and it might be more comfortable if you want to take them. Okay, so even though I'm the moderator, I guess I'm next on the list also to speak. And my name is Elizabeth Byce, and I'm a leading member of Socialist Action and a retired 30-year postal worker. And my claim to fame, of course, I was raised in Newfoundland. I grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador in a small town east of Gander. Though I've lived in Toronto for over 40 years, I'm still a proud Newfoundlander. Maybe I should say I'm a proud adopted Newfoundlander, because actually I was born in Sweden. So I have a distant connection to the Vikings. They settled briefly on the northern peninsula at Lanza Meadows over 1,000 years ago. Hundreds of years later, Newfoundland became the first European colony. Fishers from Portugal, France, Ireland, Scotland, and England came for the cod. The British built permanent settlements. They slaughtered the Beothuk people, or Aboriginal people. In fact, there are stories that's been told that they actually used them for target practice. Completely wiped them out.
Terrible.
The fish and lumber economy came to be dominated by wealthy merchant families, like the Boring brothers. Remember them? Boring stores? You've seen them around. Aaron Sons. Workers formed unions, especially among fishers and in mining and forestry. Labor militancy took root. Internally, most of its population was spread widely around a rugged coastline in small outport settlements. Many were distant from cities and isolated for long periods by winter ice or bad weather. These conditions generated new ways of thinking and acting. Newfoundland and Labrador developed a wide variety of distinctive customs, beliefs, stories, songs, and dialects. Newfoundland lost about 1/4 of its young men in the imperialist First World War. During World War II, the United States set up military bases at Argentia, Gander, Stevensville, Goose Bay, and St. John's. Newfoundland and Labrador became a colony in 1825. It was self-governing from 1855 to 34 and held Dominion status from 1907 to 49. Britain raided its treasury to pay for World War I. The ensuing economic crisis caused the elected Newfoundland government to fail. It was replaced by a commission of government. The commission was a group of rich men appointed by Britain. In 1948, the population was subject to two rigged referendum campaigns and 2 fraudulent votes. The details are recorded in a book titled Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders by actor and writer Greg Malone. So the former Dominion, then a colony again, lost its chance at responsible government. It joined Canada on Ottawa's terms as a province on March 31st, 1949. Opposition to Confederation, which was actually the majority view, because I said earlier it was a fraudulent vote. So it was actually the view, opposition to Confederation, which was actually the view of the majority, of which my parents were part of it, and I'm proud to say. And I still am, as you can see my Republic of Newfoundland flag.
Good.
The opposition was concentrated mostly among residents of the capital, St. John's, and on the Avalon Peninsula. It included most left-of-center people and pro-union folks. In 2003, in a poll, 72% of residents identified first as Newfoundlanders, secondly as Canadians. You ever run into a Newfoundlander? I'm sure you've all. The first thing they'll say, I'm a Newfoundlander, before they say they're Canadian. Separatist sentiment was still around 12% in 2003. Newfoundland and Labrador could have been a republic in control of its own will. Instead, its resources were pillaged, most of the profits sent elsewhere. Its people were victims of fraud and snake oil salesmen funded by Ottawa and London. It's London, England. Working to keep Washington at bay and to keep Labrador's mineral and hydro wealth for themselves. CDOs, a big Tory capitalist, later quietly extracted billions of dollars of iron ore out of Labrador West for processing in Ontario and Quebec. Canada offered residents of the Rock, as we call ourselves, on the Rock, financial incentives, including a baby bonus for each child in the family. The Confederates were led by the egomaniac Joey Smallwood, or Joey as we always called him in Newfoundland, a former radio broadcaster who had written for a socialist newspaper in New York City. As Liberal Premier of Newfoundland, Labrador, Joey was a liberal capitalist politician, certainly no socialist. His liberal and conservative political successors played the same game. Today, the province still wrestles with fish quotas, offshore oil extraction by energy giants, a culture besieged and precarious future. The latest example is the grossly over-budget hydro mega project at Muskrat Falls in Labrador. It is spun as a job engine, but is really about driving up corporate products at the expense of flooding and poisoning to traditional land at the Innu people. Genuine economic democracy is still a dream that the Canadian state and capitalists continue to thwart in Newfoundland and Labrador. But the working class will discover its destiny and take the power into our own hands. Our time will come.
Bravo.
Okay, so folks, our next speaker, let me get my papers straight here. Our next speaker is Comrade Jacqueline Chan, a young worker and a Socialist Action member.
Very good.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Jacqueline. I'm part of Socialist Action. I'm here to speak about part of the, I guess, resistance as a young worker. Canada's ugly past in many ways resembles that of our U.S. neighbors. Much of the relatively short history of the Canadian state is replete with white imperialism, colonialism, exploitation of labor, and discrimination towards people of color, though try as some may to deny it. However, there have also been people around to resist and participate in the struggle against this. From 1881 to 1885, the government utilized 15,000 immigrant temporary workers through harsh and dangerous labor conditions in order to finish building the Canadian Pacific Railway. The same year the railway was finished, the Chinese Immigration Act was born. Suddenly there were too many of Asian descent in the Great White North. This act imposed a head tax on Chinese immigrants, forcing them to pay a fee intentionally set on being financially difficult. This head tax continuously increased from $50 to $100 and even $500 in 1903, the equivalent of 2 years' salary in that same year. $500 in the year 1914, 11 years later, is equivalent to $10,000 today. Not exactly chump change. When the tax was finally repealed in 1923, Chinese were excluded altogether from immigrating into the country until 1947. The immigration rules employed extremely heavy rules of vetting. Large ledgers had indicators such as the port they arrived in, the name of the vessel upon arrival, age, sex, date of registration, any physical marks. These immigration policies only applied to the Chinese, and this prejudiced immigration was not accepted quietly. For the 24 years that this act was in effect, the Chinese actively refused to celebrate what is now known as Canada Day, for they believed it to be a humiliation day. The fact that people were often put to large vetting was not just isolated to that one incident. The Komagata Maru incident involved a Japanese steamship on which a group of citizens on the British Raj attempted to immigrate to Canada in 1914 but were denied entry. Of the 376 passengers from Punjab, British India, 24 were admitted to Canada, but the remaining 352 passengers were not allowed to disembark and the ship was forced to return. This was one of several incidents in the early 20th century in which exclusion laws in Canada and the United States were used to exclude immigrants of Asian origin. This cycle of exploitation and exclusion, first providing work as an incentive for immigration, only to be heavily exploited since the demographic aren't considered citizens, second to increase the fear of the people and to make aggrandizing generalizations, which can include a fear of the group carrying diseases, having less ethical or more moral parity than those of their white counterpart. And third, exclusionary laws are enacted in order to subdue this group, whether through limiting their immigration or preventing them from obtaining employment, so as to keep them in a lower economic strata. This recycled formula. Oh, sorry. Okay. This recycled formula is a familiar one. The rhetoric of the fear of the other has shifted over time. Mandatory residential schools for indigenous peoples were created in order to force assimilation into the accepted white culture, effectively destroying generations of indigenous families. Internment camps unjustly held Japanese Canadians, while their properties were expropriated during World War II. Although these may be events of the past, Canada's attitudes towards people of color remain steadfast. the migrant worker policy today, Parliament's reactionary safe third country rule, the rise of Islamophobia, and alt-right groups touting nationalistic rhetoric. Migrant workers are encouraged to apply for the temporary workers program, even though it applies extremely stringent rules upon workers and ties them to one employer. It allots unbalanced power to the employer, and the time that it takes to obtain a new permit is so long and bogged down by bureaucracy that workers are disincentivized from finding new employment. Thus, they will stick out abuse from employers and work overtime without pay. Migrant workers are the backbone of this country and deserve to be able to make a fair living, just as any other person. Many migrant workers are fighting for a revision of this program, demanding new rules, regulations, and with better oversight. The Safe Third Country Rule unfairly reroutes immigrants trying to reach Canada or the US. This rule dictates that immigrants who make a claim for refugee status must do so in the first safe state that they arrive in. Thus, if immigrants land in the US airport by a stopover to Canada, they will be required to make a claim for refugee status in the United States instead. This can be extremely dangerous for the person, given the rising tensions in the United States. The increasing popularity of alt-right groups that we hear about in the United States has not gone unnoticed in Canada, and particularly among those who identify as conservative, alt-right, or some sort of nationalist. A chapter of the Soldiers of Odin, a white supremacist organization, has recently began teaming up with the Jewish Defense League in order to protest immigration, particularly of Muslim descent, and the M103 amendment to add hate speech as a crime. Instead, they twist their hatred and ignorance, hide it behind a mask of fighting for free speech. The police have often sided with these alt-right organizations, increasing police presence, setting up crowd barricades. Counter-protesters have continued to face them head-on and show them that people of color, immigrants, and refugees are all welcome. Without intervention, the third element is imminent. More exclusionary laws will be passed to restrict and discriminate against the assigned scapegoats. We are young workers, and we are young workers of color who say enough is enough. There is no place for racism anywhere. Discrimination only feeds exploitation and encourages hatred and promotes fascism. Immigrants are not the problem, capitalism is the problem. And we will continue to defend immigrants and resist against a capitalistic system.